Hello and welcome to The View from 22. I'm Ben Lazarus, the Spectator's Special Projects Editor. I'm joined by Gregg Carlstrom, the Economist Middle East correspondent, and we're here today to talk about the events from Israel and Palestine this weekend. Well, listen, Greg, thanks for joining us on SpecTV today in light of what's been a very interesting couple of days. How taken aback were you on Saturday morning?
We're using the word unprecedented, and I really mean it this time. I cannot remember anything remotely like this ever happening. You've heard Israelis drawing comparisons to 1973 in the sense that this was an intelligence failure, not unlike the one that preceded the Yom Kippur War. But the scenes that played out in Israel on Saturday, these images of street-to-street fighting in Israeli cities and kibbutzes, of bodies piled up at bus stations or in houses. These are things that you ask Israelis and they say the country hasn't seen anything like this since 1948, since the War of Independence. So really an event without precedent in living memory.
And I know it's sort of the $1 million question at the moment, but how on earth did it happen? I mean, have you had any steer from contacts at all on how such a sort of security failure was allowed to happen?
No one has a good answer yet. I mean, I think some of that is going to have to wait for the inevitable commission of inquiry that looks into this after the war ends. But talking to Israelis, a couple of things come up. One of them is that the army and the security services, they've been focused elsewhere in recent months. There's been a lot of concern about the West Bank, where because of the far-right government that's been in control of Israel for about a year now, tensions are at a boil over expansion of settlements and various other policies. So there's been concern about the West Bank. There's also been concern about the North. There were a lot of worries that Hezbollah in Lebanon might try to do something not unlike this. And in Gaza, meanwhile, the belief was that Hamas was relatively quiet for now, that it was content to continue ruling over that territory, that it wanted to negotiate with Israel about things like how much money was being allowed in or how many workers were being allowed to cross into Israel every day. There was just no belief in Israel that the group would be contemplating an attack like this. So not just an intelligence failure, but a conceptual failure in the sense that you might have had some intelligence, but you weren't looking for it because you had no idea that something like this was plausible.
Mm. And where do you see Iran in all of this? I mean, obviously, last night we had the Wall Street Journal story that appeared at first to be quite well sourced in saying that Iran's hands were all over this. And certainly aspects of the attack seem to be quite professional for the Palestinians and, like the hang gliders and things like that. And just a sense that it was so multi-pronged. But now, I mean, a lot of US officials and Israeli officials are saying they have no evidence that Iran's hand was directly involved in this. The Wall Street Journal report is not correct. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, we've spoken today with American officials, Israeli officials, Arab officials, all of whom have said that they haven't seen any evidence of direct Iranian involvement in that way. So I think when we talk about Iran's role in this, there are three things that we can talk about. The first is that, of course, there was some Iranian role. Iran provides money to Hamas. It's tried to smuggle weapons into Gaza for years. It provides the group with blueprints for making drones, for making rockets, some of which we saw used against Israel on Saturday. So, of course, in that sense, there is an Iranian role. I think there was also a degree of coordination in that Hamas wouldn't do something like this, something that might draw in other groups around the region, like Hezbollah in Lebanon. It wouldn't do something like this without alerting Iran and alerting other militia groups in the neighborhood. So I think likely there was some degree of coordination quite late in the game, but the idea that Iran might have directed this, organized this, been the prime mover behind this attack, we haven't seen any evidence to support that. And again, I mean, the Israeli army spokesman went on television this morning and said they haven't seen any evidence of direct Iranian involvement. So that's a very categorical statement coming from the military itself.
And could you see Iran being dragged into this in any direct manner? I mean, that might have seemed unthinkable pre-Saturday, but I spoke to quite a prominent Israeli thinker this morning, and also another journalist who's very well connected and based in the Middle East, who seem to think both men seem to think that the idea that that Netanyahu would be toying with striking Iran directly is not out of the question currently. What would your take be on that?
Yeah, I think we all have to have a bit of humility, myself included, in how we're analyzing this right now, because this is such an unprecedented and such a confusing situation. So I agree with you when you say before Saturday, it would have been very hard to imagine this coming to a direct confrontation between Iran and Israel. But I think a couple of things that I'm looking at or looking for right now. One of them is right now what Israel is doing in Gaza, this aerial bombardment that started on Saturday. That happens, unfortunately, every few years in Gaza. That's sort of par for the course. But if the Israeli army decides to go ahead with a ground offensive that's meant to remove Hamas from power, that's the sort of thing that could draw in other groups around the region. And then this becomes a much bigger regional war, and all bets are off at that point. I also think that at some point, whether or not the Israelis think that there was direct Iranian involvement in organizing this attack, I think at some point they will want to settle accounts with the Iranians. But I don't think they're going to want to do that soon because they have a concern about this becoming a multi-front war. I mean, they're having still a difficult time regaining control of their own territory and securing their own territory. The last thing they want is for this to turn into a multi-front war. So whatever response it is they might direct at Iran, I think that's something they're going to try and push off into the longer term.
And just going back to, I mean, you mentioned the possibility of a ground invasion. Now, Netanyahu isn't really a wartime guy. I mean, he doesn't want to put boots on the ground in Gaza because the consequences of that would be a lot of bloodshed, a lot of loss of life. Obviously, most of the Hamas fighters are operating below ground in tunnels, and you're going into an area where the fighters are beneath you, and you're not going to have civilians particularly friendly to you either. So inevitably, Israel would probably lose the same amount of soldiers as they've just lost over the last few days if they were to put boots on the ground in the Gaza Strip. But Axios report this afternoon that Netanyahu briefed Joe Biden on the phone yesterday that they were going to shortly launch a ground invasion, and the story seems quite well sourced. When do you think that might take place, if it is indeed going to take place, and how do you think that is going to play out?
I do think it will take place, not because Netanyahu wants it to take place, not because the army wants it to take place, but I think it's inevitable at this point. I mean, I remember in 2014, during the 50-day war in the summer of 2014, there was a push from the Israeli right to do a ground invasion of Gaza. Netanyahu ignored that because the army was worried that it was going to be a bloody urban quagmire. You look at what's happened now, though. I mean, the trigger for this war is so much bigger than the trigger for the 2014 war. The public mood is very much in favor of a strong response, and the governing coalition in Israel is a far-right coalition. So I think there's going to be unsurmountable pressure to go ahead with a ground invasion. But and probably later this week. I think the military right now needs a few more days to call up reservists, to move material and equipment to the border with Gaza. But I think it's something that within the next week or so, more likely than not, will go ahead. But the question is just then, what's the end game? I mean, there's that famous David Petraeus line from the Iraq War where he said, "Tell me how this ends." And it's the same question now. You go in big on the ground. Let's say you find some way to remove Hamas from power. You decapitate the leadership. You take control of a large part of Gaza. Then what? The Palestinian Authority is too weak to come in and exert authority. There's been some idle talk about Arab peacekeeping forces coming in, but there's no Arab state that wants to do that. Israel doesn't want to reoccupy Gaza again indefinitely. So even if you do a ground invasion, even if you do decapitate the Hamas leadership, then what? Who takes charge after that? And no one really has an answer for that.
How concerned are you about Lebanon and the potential for Hezbollah to get involved here? I mean, there's obviously been skirmishes today, and it doesn't sound like that it's Hezbollah officially, that it might be just sort of various militant type groups who are testing the waters. But there's obviously been a few skirmishes on that border. And you mentioned before that the Israelis were quite concerned about the Lebanese border before. So how much scope do you see that might be the case that Hezbollah might decide to make a move this week?
I think it's a real concern that they might be drawn into the war. I don't want to discount that at all. The messaging that they have sent indirectly to the Israelis is that if there is a big ground offensive in Gaza, that is what would draw us into the war. So they've tried to make it clear almost that if this war goes the way the 2014 war went, they will sit on the sidelines. If it turns much bigger than that, then they will get involved. What we've seen so far, there was some shelling yesterday, some mortar shelling from Lebanon on an area called the Sheba Farms, which is in the Golan Heights. It's a disputed area. Lebanon claims it is Lebanese, Syria claims it is Syrian, the Israelis control it. And that's an area where there has been periodic fighting before, and there's almost an understanding that if Hezbollah attacks that area, they don't want it to escalate into anything more than that. So that I read as a symbolic show of support for the Palestinians, but trying to stop well short of getting involved. Then today we've had reports that a few gunmen from Lebanon crossed the border into Israel, were killed by the Israeli army. Hezbollah very quickly put out a statement after that saying this wasn't us, this was some Palestinian gunmen who got overexcited, was essentially the statement that they put out. So again, trying to make it clear that they don't want this to escalate. And they can't in some ways afford this to escalate. Lebanon is mired in one of the worst economic crises in modern history right now. And there's a lot of Lebanese, even people who are Hezbollah supporters, who might be cheering on the Palestinians, but don't want their own country to get involved. And so it would be very politically risky for Hezbollah to do that. I think on balance, they want to stay out, but logic doesn't always apply in these situations. And something could happen that starts you up the escalation ladder, as political scientists call it. And whether you want to escalate or not, it ends up becoming something bigger.
I mean, you mentioned before that they sort of have sent out this warning that if Israel was to go, put boots on the ground in the Gaza Strip, that would be the moment where they might have to be drawn in. I mean, how much of a red line is that for them? I mean, would there be conditions on, whether Israel goes a mile into the Gaza Strip or whether they, just simply enter the Gaza Strip? What would the conditions be that you think would cross the red line for Hezbollah there?
We don't know, and I'm not sure anyone knows the answer to that. I mean, going back again to the idea of this being so unprecedented, I don't think even some of the leadership in Lebanon really has an answer for that. So I think they're going to have to weigh, on the one hand, wanting to seem like they're supporting Hamas and supporting the Palestinians, on the other hand, not wanting to alienate the Lebanese population. And then there's also an external consideration of what would the Iranians want them to do? And you could say that Iran might want them to get involved because it might want to take pressure off of Hamas in Gaza and make this a bloodier multi-front war for the Israelis. You could also say at the same time, they might want Hezbollah to sit it out, because if one of their proxies in Gaza is being degraded by an Israeli ground offensive, they don't want to risk another one of their proxies in Lebanon. So there's a lot of factors at work here, and I really don't have a definitive answer.
Greg, just turning to the hostages for a second, there's supposedly around 130, according to estimates, Israeli civilians and indeed some foreign nationals as well, who've been captured and taken back to the Gaza Strip. Hamas said that I think about 4 were killed overnight during the Israeli airstrikes. How significant will the hostages be when it comes to the sort of Israeli response to Hamas here, both when it comes to the possibility of boots on the ground and also when it comes to launching air assaults?
I think in the first few days of this, the hostages haven't been that much of a military consideration. We didn't know in the hours and days after this attack happened, we didn't know how many hostages there were. We didn't know where they had been taken. The Israeli government really didn't have any information about this. And there are some reports that Hamas itself might not have known how many hostages were taken because it was chaotic on Saturday, and they're not sure who took hostages and where they brought them. So the Israelis were focused on just beginning the aerial response and not really thinking about the hostages. I think that calculus will start to change as they get a better sense of where these people are, as public pressure to do something about the hostage situation mounts, and the Israeli government, is dealing with tearful families who want to know why their sons and daughters haven't been freed yet. It's going to start to mount. And I think certainly when it comes to the question of a ground invasion, you have to weigh, on the one hand, you could try to go in and free people in raids. On the other hand, they could be killed in the crossfire. There is a risk that a large ground invasion that makes Hamas think its grip on power is threatened could lead them to start executing hostages. These are all things that people are thinking about in the Israeli defense establishment and don't really have an answer for. They've dealt once or twice with having one or two hostages held, but the idea that there are more than 100 people scattered across the Gaza Strip is something that Israeli army officers have never had to contemplate before.
What sort of conditions do you think the hostages will be held under? I mean, obviously we've seen lots of women. There's lots of evidence of rape, certainly from the music festival. Indeed, there was a clip of one female hostage, and it looked quite apparent on the stains on her trousers that she had probably been assaulted. There's obviously there's soldiers, there's male civilians, but there's also very elderly people held hostage too. What sort of conditions do you think they might be held under currently?
I mean, the hope is that the logic for Hamas will be that these hostages are worth far more alive and well treated than they are dead or abused. So you would hope that logic would prevail. I mean, if the idea here for Hamas is that they want to exchange these people in a prisoner swap with Israel in exchange for Palestinian prisoners, you would hope that gives them some incentive to treat them well. But what conditions they're being held in, I mean, again, I think it's really impossible to say, just considering how unprecedented this all is.
I mean, one of the things that strikes me, I mean, when it's sort of on Saturday, it became so apparent how many people have been taken, and I should, for to be perfectly honest, I do actually have a distant relative who's one of the hostages, very distant relative, but an 84-year-old grandmother, great grandmother, in fact, is among the people they captured and took over. With Gilad Shalit, and I think it was 2006, after he was held for about 5 years, the Israelis had to give 1,000 soldiers in exchange, not soldiers, militants, terrorists, whatever you want to call them. The price that Hamas would try and enact in exchange for handing over 130 civilians, I mean, is that a cost that the Israeli government can bear?
Right. It will be an astronomical price. There was a senior leader of Hamas who was interviewed a couple of days ago who said that, in his view, we have enough hostages to free all of our prisoners, all of the Palestinian prisoners being held in Israeli jails. There are about 5,200 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. So they are looking at this as an opportunity for the biggest prisoner release that anyone has ever secured in Palestine to boost their own political standing. I don't see there being much public appetite for that in Israel. I mean, in the past, there has been. The Shalit deal polls at the time showed there was majority support, 2/3, 75% of Israelis supported the Shalit deal, even though the numbers were so lopsided. But I think what makes this different for the public is that people are they're burying their dead. And I don't think they're going to be eager to make a deal with the group that just killed 800 or more Israelis. And I think for the government, there's going to be a real concern about the precedent this sets. I mean, if you reward what was the largest attack in Israel's history with a mass prisoner release, you're all but inviting someone else to try that again. So I know there's obviously going to be pressure from the families and emotions are going to be running high, but I can't imagine a great number of Israelis rushing to make a prisoner swap right now.
And I read that Qatar and various other countries are sort of looking to sort of get involved and advise on how some civilians, or at least women and children, could be released. Do you put any merit on those sort of murmurings, or do you think it's all just sort of hot air?
Hot air, and these countries wanting to look like they have a role and they're doing something. But I think the Israeli government right now, I mean, I think the primary focus is going to be on the military response. I don't think it's going to be on doing a prisoner deal. That's something that perhaps down the road they'll be thinking about. But just given the scale of the anger and the grief in Israel after what happened on Saturday, I think this government feels like it needs to respond rather than talking about an exchange.
Just turning to the domestic political situation within Israel currently, what is the response to Netanyahu likely to be here? I mean, obviously he's been seen as a strong man of Israel for decades, but this huge intelligence failure has happened on his watch, and now there's big questions to ask whether they get put boots on the ground, whether they carry on with airstrikes, how they get hostages back, etc., etc. What is the sort of likely Israeli public response to Netanyahu and his government currently?
Right. I mean, Netanyahu is a politician who, for decades, has based his public appeal on security, on the idea that I am the most responsible steward of Israeli security. And he's now presided over the biggest security failure in Israel in half a century. So it is hard to imagine this is anything other than the end of his political career. He's going to try and avoid that. Of course, one thing he's going to do, which is what he often does, is try to shift the blame onto the heads of the military and the security services. There's a reason if you go through a list of former Israeli army chiefs or Mossad directors who served under Netanyahu, the vast majority of them, when they leave office, end up being very, very sharp critics of the prime minister, because when things go well, he takes credit, and things go badly, someone else is always to blame. So he's going to try and shift the blame, but I don't see that working. I mean, the backdrop to this is almost a year of ongoing protest and political turmoil over the judicial reforms and some of the other policies of his right-wing government. He has surrounded himself with some very inexperienced ministers. The head of the police, Itamar Ben-Gvir, is a right-wing ideologue who has no security background, didn't even serve in the military. So I think all of this is going to end up, when the inevitable early elections are called, when the dust settles, it's really hard to imagine this is not the end of his career as prime minister.
And do you think some of the distraction of the last year has been what fed into the Palestinians taking this moment now to suddenly launch this offensive?
You hear that argument both from Israelis and Palestinians. Yeah, I mean, Israelis will say that the prime minister has been distracted. He hasn't been thinking about security. He's been thinking about other things. There have been some questions around military readiness. For example, Army reservists who have been threatening to boycott their mandatory service because they want to protest the judicial reforms. Some of that is probably overblown in terms of its impact, because these boycotts were not large scale and they didn't go on for that long. But yeah, I think this was also noticed on the other side. I think Palestinians noticed that the Israeli government was distracted. The security services, at least from the headlines that you could see, seemed like they might be in disarray, and that probably made this seem like a more opportune moment to strike.
Just turning to the US for a second, since the withdrawal of Afghanistan, there's been one could argue there's been a power vacuum in the Middle East. America is currently without ambassadors in Egypt, Lebanon, and also in Israel. How significant do you think the sort of pullback of America from the region has been in the thinking of the region's players, whether Iran, Hamas, or Hezbollah?
I'm not sure it's that significant. This is, of course, the scale of this attack is unprecedented, but it's hardly the first time that we've had a war in Gaza or concerns about a war between Israel and Lebanon. So I'm not sure that America's inattention or America's distraction really played a role here. But I do think one thing this points to is America has had a theory about the region for a number of years. And I would say it started under Donald Trump and it's continued under Joe Biden. This idea that America's main goal in the Middle East should be to focus on Israeli-Arab normalization deals, things like the Abraham Accords under Donald Trump, and then Biden's efforts to bring the Saudis into the Abraham Accords. And the idea was that if you could get Israel and Arab states working together, talking together, that you would calm the region, that you would perhaps do something to ease the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That was how they approached Middle East policy. That was their central focus. And we saw in the most spectacular and gruesome fashion on Saturday that it doesn't work that way, that these old problems of the Middle East, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the oldest of them, they're not going to go away just because the UAE and Bahrain and maybe Saudi Arabia signed normalization deals with Israel. There's been a real American inattention to those issues for many years now. And I think this should be a reminder that on a diplomatic level, America needs to be a bit more engaged.
Okay, well, look, thank you very much for joining us on Spectator TV today, Greg. It's been really interesting talking to you and incredibly insightful. So thank you very much.